What turns a prince into a monster, or a monster into a nation's shield? To defeat an army marching under the banner of God and conquest, must one summon the devil himself? In the spring of 1462, these questions hung thick in the air over Wallachia, heavy as the smoke of 1,000 burning villages. The air itself tasted of grit and despair. As the mighty Ottoman army, the conquerors of Constantinople, crossed the shimmering Danube, they expected resistance. But not this. Not a silence so profound it was louder than any war cry. Sultan Mehmed II, a man whose ambition was matched only by his military genius, rode at the head of nearly 90,000 elite soldiers, a tide of steel and faith poised to swallow the defiant principality of Wallachia whole. Their scouts had promised a land of rolling green hills, plentiful villages, and clear streams. What they found was a monochrome nightmare, painted in shades of gray and black. The fields were torched, the earth blackened and cracked under the relentless sun. The spring harvest, meant to feed a nation, had been systematically annihilated, becoming nothing more than acres of brittle, charred stalks that crunched under the hooves of their horses. The soldiers marched deeper, their thirst growing with every mile. They would find a village well, rush to it with parched throats, only to recoil in horror. The water was putrid, cloudy with poison, sometimes with the bloated carcass of a sheep or a dog thrown in to ensure its foulness. It was a message, chilling and clear. This land will not sustain you. It will kill you. Entire towns stood empty, their doors creaking on rusty hinges in the desolate wind. Not a soul was left. No crying children, no barking dogs, no merchants in the square. The populations had vanished, either evacuated by force or eradicated. The Ottomans found no food, no shelter from the oppressive heat, and, most critically, no information. They were marching blind into a self-inflicted wound. Vlad III, voivode of Wallachia, had turned his own kingdom into a weapon. He knew his small, outnumbered army could never survive a pitched battle against Mehmed's legions, so he made the land itself his ally. In a letter to the Hungarian king, he would later boast with chilling candor, "I have killed, we have burned down everything." This was not random cruelty. It was a strategy of annihilation. Morale, once ironclad, began to rust. The Janissaries, the Sultan's elite guard, were warriors forged in the fires of conquest, yet they were not prepared for this. They were trained to fight men, not phantoms. Disease, born of filth and bad water, began to creep through their ranks. Hunger gnawed at their bellies. The silence of the empty land was filled with the whispers of fear and doubt. This was not war. This was a slow, agonizing descent into hell. As Mehmed's exhausted army finally neared the heart of Wallachia, the fortress capital of Targoviste, a flicker of hope returned. Here, finally, would be a battle. Here, they could unleash their fury and training. The spires of the citadel rose against the horizon, a promise of confrontation. But as they drew closer, they noticed something strange lining the road. A new kind of forest, planted by a diabolical gardener. It was not a forest of trees. It was a grotesque avenue of tall, sharpened wooden stakes. And upon each stake a trophy was mounted. Not the heads of nobles or captured banners, but the bodies of their own comrades. Scouts, raiders, and advance parties who had vanished in the preceding weeks were now here to greet them, their silent agony a testament to the voivode's brand of hospitality. The path to the main fortress gates was a gallery of horrors. Some bodies were fresh, others had been left to the elements, their forms distorted by the sun and carrion birds. The air, already thick with the dust of the march, now carried a new, sweet, and sickly stench, the smell of decay, on an industrial scale. This was psychological warfare in its most visceral form, designed not just to repel, but to shatter the very soul of the invading army. Among the grim figures was a special display, a direct message to the Sultan. Before the invasion, Mehmed had sent envoys to Vlad. According to Saxon chronicles, when the diplomats refused to remove their turbans in Vlad's presence, citing religious custom, the voivode had offered a chilling solution. "Then let me strengthen your customs," he had reportedly declared, before ordering their turbans to be nailed directly to their skulls. Now here they were, elevated on stakes near the main gate, their preserved forms a mockery of diplomacy and a declaration of absolute defiance. The sight stunned even the most hardened veterans. This wasn't a warning. It was a blasphemy against the very rules of war. It was Vlad screaming to Mehmed across a field of corpses, "There are no rules here. Your power means nothing in my domain of pain." Nothing could have prepared them for what lay in the valley before Targoviste. Not the scorched earth, not the poisoned wells, not even the ghoulish sentinels lining the road. For here, Vlad had unveiled his masterpiece, a sprawling, meticulously arranged panorama of terror that would be seared into the annals of history. It was a field stretching for kilometers, and on it stood a forest of the impaled. 20,000 souls, 20,000 stakes. The scale was inhuman, incomprehensible. Ottoman prisoners, captured Bulgarian soldiers, and even Wallachian subjects accused of treason were displayed in a macabre spectacle of geometric precision. They were arranged in concentric circles, in long, unwavering lines, their heights varying to create a ghastly, undulating landscape of death. The method itself was an art of cruelty. A sharpened but not too sharp stake was driven through the body, carefully avoiding vital organs to prolong the agony. The victims, hoisted into the air, could remain alive for hours, sometimes days, a slow, torturous demise under the uncaring sky. This was not execution. This was performance art, and the audience was Mehmed's army. Sultan Mehmed II, the conqueror of cities, the shadow of God on earth, reined in his magnificent warhorse. His generals fell silent. The entire vanguard of the world's most powerful army stood frozen, staring. The sound of the wind whistling through the ghastly forest was the only sound to be heard. Tursun Bey, an Ottoman chronicler present at the scene, would later write that the Sultan was visibly shaken. Before him was not a battlefield, but a monument to one man's will, a man who had sacrificed 20,000 lives simply to make a point. Mehmed, a man of war and conquest, accustomed to brutality, looked out upon the field and spoke, his voice a mixture of disgust and a strange, chilling respect. "How can we defeat a man," he murmured, "who does such things? He is willing to do to his own people and his enemies what I would not dare." This was the climax of Vlad's strategy. He wasn't just killing soldiers, he was killing the idea of victory. He was showing Mehmed that to conquer Wallachia, he would have to become a greater monster than Vlad himself. And in that moment, staring into the vacant eyes of thousands, the great Sultan hesitated. The war was no longer about territory, it was a contest of souls. While the dead served as monuments of fear, Vlad reserved a special fate for a select few. Some captives were not impaled. They were not executed. They were edited. They were transformed into living proclamations of his boundless cruelty and then sent back, walking, stumbling nightmares meant to spread a contagion of terror far more effectively than any rumor. Imagine a small group of Ottoman soldiers huddled around a meager campfire in the dead of night, their stomachs empty, their nerves frayed. Suddenly figures emerge from the darkness, not attackers, but men in the tattered remains of Ottoman uniforms, their own comrades. But they are changed. One stumbles forward, his face a mask of scar tissue where his nose and ears used to be. Another has had his eyes damaged, leaving him to wander in a world of eternal twilight. They didn't speak of battles. They were the battle itself, carved onto their very bodies. Slavic chronicles tell of these grim messengers, released by Vlad with calculated purpose. Noses, ears, and lips were common targets. Sometimes limbs were broken and left to heal at unnatural angles. These were not random acts of rage. They were surgical strikes against the enemy's morale, each mutilation a carefully chosen word in a sentence of dread. These survivors would stumble back into their own camps, and a silence would fall. It was a fear that went beyond the battlefield. A soldier could accept death by a sword. But this was a violation of the soul. To be captured by the Wallachians didn't just mean death. It meant you could be unmade, turned into a grotesque parody of a man, and sent home as a living trophy for your enemy. To Mehmed the Conqueror, this was the ultimate insult. It was a barbarian's act, a rejection of all imperial decorum and the established codes of warfare. A ruler who sent back his enemies in pieces was a ruler who feared no consequence, no divine retribution, no earthly reprisal. Each maimed soldier who returned to the Ottoman lines was a personal letter from Vlad to the Sultan, written in blood and scar tissue, saying, "I am boundless. What will you do?" In the end, Mehmed's army took the empty city of Targoviste. It was a hollow victory. The voivode had already vanished into the mountains, ready to continue his campaign of guerrilla warfare and psychological attrition. The great Ottoman army, exhausted, starving, and demoralized, could not sustain its position. The conqueror of the New Rome was forced to retreat from the wretched, haunted land of Wallachia. He had not been defeated by an army. He had been defeated by an idea. The idea that one man's will, fueled by absolute ruthlessness, could transform a nation's weakness into its greatest strength. Vlad Tepes had held a mirror up to the empire, and what it saw in the reflection was a horror it could not stomach. His victory was not written in treaties, but in the nightmares of Ottoman soldiers. Vlad's reign of terror was a calculated masterpiece of asymmetric warfare. The scorched earth denied the enemy sustenance. The forests of the impaled shattered their courage. The mutilated messengers destroyed their morale from within. He turned fear itself into a policy, a strategy, a shield. He became the monster his people needed to fend off the dragons at their door. His legacy remains a paradox, carved not in stone, but left to rot on a wooden stake. Was he a sadistic tyrant, or a national hero, a devil or a savior? Perhaps he was both. He was a man who understood the dark algebra of power, that sometimes, to save everything you hold dear, you must be willing to sacrifice not only your enemies, but your own humanity as well.